So, yeah, I think I'm ready to start. So I can whenever you want.
Yeah, I guess.
Yeah, might as well get rolling.
Yep.
Thank you, everyone. Here's Christian's gonna roll for you. Enjoy.
Thank you.
So let me first say hello to everyone. So my name is Christian Hahn, and this presentation is about let's editors maintain their policies again in real time inside CoXC. So let me first just a few words to me. So that's me, Christian Hahn, psycho freelancer from Germany, 3 times Commerce MVP now, and yeah, working for different projects, different customers, and therefore collecting all the time different requirements I try to fulfill with custom implementations to extend out of the box commerce engine. So then, of course, let's start with the topic. So what will I tell you in the next, I think, 40-45 minutes? You saw from the headline that I will talk about editors, maintainabilities of policies. So we should first start with what is a policy. So I try to tell all of you what a policy is, what you can do with a policy, what a policy is in this bigger, I would say, cosmos of commerce engine. What is a policy? What is environment? What are roles? So you understand the basic terminology. Then, of course, the main topic here is how to bring these policies and policy changes live. And there you will see there are some pitfalls, especially when you're talking about content editor editability. And of course, the session is about a solution. So I try to offer you a custom plugin, a custom solution to overcome that situation. And I admit this topic, integration of settings plugin, is mostly for developer, but definitely important that this plugin is also easily integratable into your custom solutions. So it should not take a day or two to integrate that solution. That would easily not be worth it. And last but not least, what I try in all of my presentation, in general, I try to let the audiences or to let the developer understand what's behind the scenes. So not only to show what is the settings plugin, to also, but also show what's behind. So where do I have to hook in? How do I create, for example, new applications? So in the future, maybe you can do it already or also on your own. That's one of my goals, of course. So in general, session goals. The first big session goal in this time is get an idea of how to overcome that issue that editors in the end are not really capable of editing or adding policy values, which you will see is not that easy. And the second session goal is to see how in general things work. That's second part of my presentation. So let's first start with how do policies work. So in the beginning, we should talk about, of course, policies. What are policies? How can policies be maintained? And of course, you should get an understanding of what's behind the scenes of policies to really understand what are the pitfalls. So let me start with general terminologies of policies. So in the end, a policy is nothing more than a JSON file or even more a part of a JSON file. Like you can see in the picture below, you can see a specific policy of a specific plugin, like which has in the end a lot of properties you can set, and you use a policy in the end once you want to make your custom plugin configurable. If we think of scenarios that your custom plugin should act differently depending on the environment, if it's authoring or shops, or depending on the stage where it is used. For example, if you use your plugin in the development environment or in the test environment or production environment. Easiest example is that the endpoint changes, credential changes, or any other data. So once you have scenarios like this, you use policies like you can see here. And to make this picture clear and to make this picture complete, on the right-hand side, you see the C# class. So policy file, this JSON file, and the C# policy is tightly coupled to each other, as you can see. Once you create a policy in the environment file in this JSON notation, you see that the property name is linked this key attribute is linked to the property name of the class. So that's how they are linked together, and that's how they are added and used. One side note to the policies, which is quite important and you have to know for later. These policies are in the end files, and if you maintain a file, edit something in the file, you have to copy over the file to the target server and call the bootstrap command, which does nothing more than grabbing all the attributes, all the policies in that environment and pushes it to the database so that later on the C# classes policy class can grab these values, just to keep in mind for later. Then let's go on. Let's talk about this policy together with how it works or how it is combined in that bigger topics of speaking of commerce engine. So you think a policy is a big thing, but no, if we have a wider view, a policy is just a really, really small portion of an environment file. So an environment file is that JSON file, and an environment file consists of a lot of policies in the end. And you maintain the environment file and you copy over the environment file. And of course, that's not all. If you have even a wider view, you see that you don't have one environment file. You have, in standard scenarios, up to 3 environment files, like for authoring, shops, and minions, like you will see in a second. So if we are now see that we have authoring, shops, and minions on the right-hand side, let's ignore the ops. Ops is a role inside Commerce, but mostly it has no custom environment. It uses the authoring environment, so it's marked red, just for the reason of that it should be complete. I added it here, but mostly you have authoring, shops, and minions. And this is a common standard scaled approach of sidecar commerce. So in the end, if you scale up sidecar commerce, you do not have one single commerce engine. You have one single commerce engine, more or less, for each role, like authoring, shops, and minions. And to better understand what these roles are, in the end, these roles are, from the coding perspective, from the code base, exactly the same. They have just different environment files, so just different policy values, which make these commerce engines, these roles, completely independent from each other. And they have dedicated traffic to serve. For example, the authoring commerce engine is located really near to the content management system, and therefore it serves mostly administrative traffic, so editorial traffic, like from BizFX, like from the content management system, whereas the shops role is really close to the content delivery system, and it serves the end user traffic. And there you can also think of scenarios where you want to have different policy values for these environments. Like if you think of caching, you can think of scenarios where the content authors do not need caching. They want to have content up to date, always up to date, and they can wait a second or two to load the content. Whereas the shops user, they want to have a performance side, they want to have fast side. There you mostly add caching in the environment, in the policy values. So they are really, really specialized to the kind of the traffic they serve. And therefore we have different environments. And to really, I think, to close it up, that's also not all. So if we extend that view and not only having authoring, shops, and minions in mind, keeping them in mind, we also have these pairs of environment, authoring, shops, and minions per storefront. So if you have another storefront in SUGCON, like think of B2B and B2C shop, which are not closely coupled, they have different sites, and therefore in the backend they should have different environments, like they have different catalogs, different pricing logic, different other settings which should be set. So in the backend, in the commerce backend, you create different environment files for these storefront. So you see the number of storefronts, the number of environment files is multiplied by the number of storefronts. And therefore, in a common scenario, you see already in 2 storefronts, you have up to 6 environments files, all holding your policy values. So keep that in mind if we're talking about changing a policy value and bringing that live. Then let's have a look at a simple scenario, like a customer scenario. So in the scenario, it's pretty standard and was taken from the beginning. So we see the adventure work side, the customer side, and the habitat side. So 3 storefronts in the end. So we see we have 3 authoring, 3 minions, and 3 shops files. So in the end, 9 environment files to maintain, to handle. And a little sneak preview to how you deploy that stuff is the following picture. So depending on your deployment strategy, it might be also the case that you extend also these files with stage-specific files, like we see development, production, staging, or whatever stage you have beside your development environment. So I know there are a lot of ways to deploy Commerce Engine, and it's not really unified. So I saw approaches with manual deployments where the DevOps tools took over the responsibility for environment transformations. But also on the last symposium, I presented a topic and a plugin where you have the possibility to also extend SUGCON with capability of having these files in your local repository and maintain them there. But also, if you think of that, we again multiply the number of environments not only by storefronts, but also by number of stages. So we see we have an enormous numbers of environment files. And once we would like to change a specific policy value in all of these files, maybe it's in the end a lot of effort already to change it, but also to bring that live, just to keep that in mind. Now let's come back to the point where we want to use a policy. As you have seen, the JSON notation, which is bootstrapped to the database, and the data are lying in the database. So on the other side, we saw the C# file, in this case, this PIM importer policy, and you can just in your custom code, just grab the current policy from context.getPolicy. So this context.getPolicy is a pretty standard functionality with which a developer can grab the current policy values depending on the current environment. So if your plugin is called by a B2B shop and a B2C shop, which have different environments in the background, the system knows from where the call comes and which environment to choose. So on runtime, it determines which policy it should display you or it should give you. And in the end, you can just access the properties and just use them. So also this as preparation, keep that in mind. We will use that later on. So to sum it up, to speak in SUGCON terminologies, these policy files, these JSON files, are in the end nothing more than from XP config files, like our patch files, like our XML knotted config files under app config include folder. And if you have that in mind, we also maybe know already the limitations we have if we try to deploy that stuff. So next topic, we would like to bring policy value changes live now. So what do we have to do to bring all these changes live from the requirements? So the content author tells me as a developer, please change value X to Z. So I have to change it. And now you see what's behind the scenes or what has to be done to really change that value, because we are talking about files, config files, JSON files. In the end, the editor is obviously not able to change these files because normally content editors, the user role, you call it, has no access to the file system. That's normally the case, and also in SUGCON the case. So once you would like to change a policy value, the content also has to ask the developer, and the developer needs to execute exactly these steps. He changes it locally. He commits and pushes these changes so that can be deployed later on. Then you deploy to the target server, and here again, depending on your deployment strategy, if it's manually, automatically, or whatever way you use, it's maybe more or less painful to deploy that just once the editor tells you to deploy. So it can happen that a change of value and deploy this can, for example, take minutes, but it can also take hours to deploy the Commerce Engine. Again, up to your deployment strategy. But in the end, if you deployed, for example, the policy changes to the target server, of course, we make bootstrap. And once we did a bootstrap, the new value is available for the content author. And as you can see, that's not that good. So I had exactly that situation where I said in the backlog refinement the editor asks, okay, you make something editable also for me, and I just had to tell the editor, no, unfortunately, that's not that easy. Just tell me and I will change the value and deploy as soon as possible. So it was okay for that time, but it was really unsatisfied for the content author, but also for me as a developer. So then I thought there must be a better solution. So one thing came into my mind, the Sidecore XP solution. So I took from the Helix documentation exactly this sentence. So we differentiate configuration from setting in that settings are aimed for the user roles and configuration is aimed at the developer role. So this quote is quite nice because it's exactly our situation. So what did we do? We created configurations and not settings in Sidecore XE. So it's definitely not for the content author, for the editors, and he should not use it. Little side note, even if he would have access to the file system, he could not use it because Sidecore recommendation is after Bootstrap, you should delete all the JSON files for security reasons because in the end, they are not needed anymore. They are a security risk and all the data are then stored in the database. So there would not even be files to be edited. So we should think of a different solution like settings. And let's extend that quote a little bit with terminologies. So if we extend that quote with terminologies, you see configuration, as we expected, are files, and settings are in Sidecore XP environments are items. So items can be maintained by content author with the proper rights. They can normally have a global settings item. They can maintain it. They see the changes after they publish it. So they are happy. So we have to think of something which is similar to Sidecore XP items. This is quite easy. It is Sidecore XE entities. So what an item is in Sidecore XP is in the end an entity in Sidecore XE. So basically, you can think of the solution that you provide the content editors entities which they can maintain. So the result or the outcome of everything is a custom settings plugin, which can now be used by developers to integrate into solutions and by editors to maintain their settings again. So what's behind this settings plugin? So it's not only that I created a settings entity, but also some logic around. So some views, some BizFX applications, some handling for the developer. So some out of the box logic are also applied to that settings plugin, which can be used by you. So the goals. Let's talk about the goals of the settings plugin. So I was faced the issue that, or I would say, the situation where I could just create a specific plugin just for my customer or a generic one which can be reused all the time. So the goals were the plugin should provide easy access to the policies, to the values of the policies, so the content editors can maintain them, but as well it should be easy integratable into custom solutions, obviously. So if a developer says he needs 2 days to integrate that solution, that plugin to his solution, so it would just not be worth it. So also as well, it should not be in general easy integratable, but once the content editor says, I want to have editorial settings for this plugin and that plugin and this property, it should also be easy editable by developers. So new policies should be easy editable. And of course, I think the main target is no need for file deployment. So we go away from files and just use entities. That's the main goal. And now let's have a look what the outcome is. So you can see the BizFX applications, and you can see also here a customer example. At some points it blurred, but later on you definitely will see the customer name. So don't worry, it's okay. I asked the customer to show his backend in this case. So what we see is it's a settings application. So I created just a new BizFX application called settings. And if we go deeper into that settings application and have a look at the settings application, we can see it holds a list, for example, of settings entities. So really, really basic approach to have an application which should maintain all the entities. So here you can see a list of entities like settings entities, and you can see out of the box a default setting, which I provide you so you have already a setting applied. Then on the right-hand side, you see a button for editorial reason. So you are able to create new settings, you are able to remove settings, but as well as activate and deactivate them. So you, or in the end, the editor is able to just create new settings, to maintain them, to fill them with values, and then decide if it should be activated or deactivated. And of course, an activation of one setting entity deactivates all the other setting entities, so that just one single setting entity is active at a time and can be used. So then let's have a look into that settings entity. If you have a look now, you see it's a really basic entity with just one little extension. This is active capability, so that the setting knows if it's active or not. You will see nothing more, and that's intentionally this way. So what I provide you is the basic construct of this entity. And it's exactly this way because of SUGCON's SUGCON architectural concept of composition. So if you would like to extend that settings entity, it's quite easy in general with components. You just create your own component, hook it into this settings entity, and then of course be able to display the data, be able to edit the data, and then you will see that the settings entity grows depending on your business needs. And of course, if you would do that on your own, it would be quite time consuming. So I also provided you a lot of basic functionality to help you to create your own components for your settings entity. And I lied, it's not a component. So normally you would just extend settings entity or entities in general with components via composition. But in this case, a special case, it was quite difficult because the first approach I thought of is, okay, I create a component, add that component to the settings entity, and that's it. But the difficulty is a component cannot be a policy at the same time because of not possible, because of that, that a class cannot inherit from more than one class, so no multiple inheritance. Therefore, I decided not to use a component because I just didn't want to just have redundant properties, redundant code, just that you have to implement a component at the properties which are already there. You see them on the right-hand side. So I decided to use policies. And it's exactly the same way. You can use a policy and extend an entity with policies. It's exactly the same than extending an entity with components. And that's quite nice because I do not even have to create a new component because it's already there. I just decided to create a new attribute which can be added to properties of that component, which triggers the naming in the BizFX applications. So once you have done that, you decided you want to have a policy participating in that settings application. You just create these attributes on your properties. Of course, there are 2 or 3 steps more, but for now, you just add these attributes. And you will see that the settings entity has a new accordion, in this case, importer settings, with all the attributes, with all the properties you previously added the attribute to. And of course, on the right-hand side, you see the edit button. And once you click the edit button, it has also out of the box an edit view. And of course, if you click the OK button in that edit view, it automatically saves the changes in the values to the property, to the policy of that settings entity. So displaying data, making them editable, having this edit form and saving stuff is already pre-implemented for you, mostly pre-implemented for you. Now, let's also have a look. What if you do not want to have a whole policy exposed to that settings application? It's quite easy. So you just don't add the editor settings attribute to these properties. You will see later on how to handle such cases, but of course it's possible. So for example, you kick out start hour and end hour, and they are not displayed anymore in the settings entity. That's it. So what did we achieve so far? When you had to look at these images, we achieved a new BizFX application the content editor can access. We achieved a basic logic around possibility to edit stuff in real time. And for you developer, a possibility to add your existing policies into that setting space. And let's see how this is done on the I would say developer side. So of course there have to be done a few things, but I guess it's pretty easy and pretty straightforward. So let's have a look at how to integrate new policies into that space. So Let's first have a look, or let me just tell you one thing. There are by now two ways of integration of new policies. It's a way I provided initially, and I also wrote about that approach, and I really got cool feedback from the community that it can also be simplified, the approach, that you do not even have to create blocks and hook them into pipelines. Therefore, I also implemented an improved approach where you even have to implement less code. But for reason of completeness, I just show you all of the approaches, so both of the approaches. So let's come to the first approach, integration of new policies. As you saw it, you can have this editor setting attribute, but as well you have to do exactly this to let the whole policy participate in that space of entity settings. In the end, 4 blocks are needed to have the functionality working. So 4 blocks for displaying data, having the button, having the form edit, just modal dialog, and having the possibility to also save something. These are these 4 blocks. And for the first integration approach, you have to create these 4 blocks per entity or per policy you would like to add to the entity. So you create these 4 blocks and hook them in exactly these pipelines. It's always the same. It's all the time the same. If you create a new accordion, which should be displayed and maintainable, you always have to do this. Then let's have a look. I told you most of the code is already implemented, and I implemented them in so-called base blocks. Like you can see, if you create your own block, you just inherit from the corresponding base block and have just write one line of code. This one line of code in this approach is needed to tell the base block which policy should be added, and for example, which added action name should be provided, and you will see later on which view name should be provided. So you just have to create the block, inherit, and write a single line of code to tell the base block what it should do. And as you can see from the other example, I just go through them. It's always the same. Inherit from the corresponding base block and tell the base block what it should do with which information. So policy, view name, and added action name. These information, as you can see, combine or link these blocks together. So once we have an accordion displayed like in the entity view, we would like to also display in this ensure action block, we would like to display the edit button. And this edit button needs to know where it should be displayed. That's done via view name. And it should also trigger an action that's done by edit action name. So you see with these namings, which should be unified over the whole plugin, you will link these blocks together. So creating 4 blocks, inherit from the base blocks, writing one single line of code, and you see that's exactly acting like seen before. But as mentioned, it could be done even easier. So it could be done, of course, via reflection. So I created 4 generic blocks, already completely pre-implemented, already hooked in exactly the pipelines. And what you now have to do is go into your policy, again at the editor settings, but on the class level, add the settings policy attribute. This attribute in the end registers our policy, this policy, to this entity WizardX application. So as you can see, I did it for this mailing as well as for Teams integration. I just went into the policy, added the settings policy on the class level, per property added the editor setting, and that's the outcome. No blocks, no inheritance, no pipelines needed. So even a simpler approach to make policies editable in that application. So quite a simple approach to make things editable. So now let's go to the other side. Of course, now we achieved that we can now maintain stuff inside QXE in the SPICFX application, but of course we would also like to use the new entity. Therefore, I provided a new commerce context extension like get settings policy. You can see this get setting policy does nothing more than grabbing the active setting if one is existing, checks if the policy is added to the settings entity and returns that policy. Otherwise, it falls back to the context policy. Quite simple, quite straightforward. If you now, in your custom plugin, here is an example, want to use the new settings policy, you can do that. You can just grab it, But keep in mind, depending on your fallback strategy, you have to always also grab the context.get policy, or it is enough to just grab the get settings policy. What I mean is, previously you saw you can override the whole policy if you add this editor setting to each property of that policy. Then it's enough to grab the new settings policy because you would like to override the whole policy. But if you just do it partially, just, I don't know, 2 or 3 of the properties are not overridden, but the rest is overridden, you can just implement your own fallback logic like seen here. You grab the standard context policy, you grab the settings policy, and determine on your own or implement on your own the fallback logic. Like in this case, pretty simple. If mailing subject from the content editor setting is not set, just fall back to the previously JSON policy value. And of course, you can think of scenarios where not all policy properties should be maintainable by content author because they have sensible data, and content author should not access such data. You could, instead of just grabbing a few properties and leaving the rest as it is, you can also think of scenarios where you just split this policy into 2 policies. The whole first policy then participates with this editor settings, and the other one is just context policy. It's completely up to you. It's just an example. It's just basic functionality you can use completely on your own as you would like to do it. So let's have a short in the end demo, but this demo is just a few slides because I just wanted to show you, or just want to show you how it works. So as you can see it, or as you saw it, it was I experimented with PIM importer policies and especially with mailing subjects. So what I do, I trigger now the PIM importer. So for the customer, I implemented a full importer, an incremental importer, and a specific product importer. And for simply for the reason that a specific product importer is much faster, I have chosen this one. So what I do is I trigger the import. In the end of the import, I have a notification block which notifies the editor of the current state of the import, so what was done by the importer. And for example, if you would like to change the settings, this is settings that the subject should be different, you can do that then. So let's have a look. The first scenario is we have a default setting which is deactivated, and what should now be displayed is, as seen before, it should display product importer report def instead of this capital letter product importer def. So if it is deactivated, it should fall back to the standard policy. And if it falls back to the standard policy, you will see after I triggered the import, I see Teams notification exactly with that name, product importer report def. And now we activate it. So I just went into the setting entity, told the system, please activate my setting entity. And now, of course, the highlighted product importer def in capital letters should be used and should be displayed. So now, as we can see, I rerun it again on the same time, just a few seconds later, and we see now product importer def in capital letters. So the example shows that each content editor can just manipulate all the provided policy properties in the BizFX application in real time, and they're directly applied in real time. So that's how things work. So let's come to the point, general approach. So what we had till now, or what we had so far, was I showed you an issue I was faced to, maybe you also were faced to. What were the issues with that approach, with that standard approach, how we could overcome it, how we could overcome it. And now let's have a look at, in general, how things are implemented to come to that point. So how is a BizFX application implemented? How are views implemented? How can you maintain such things in general? So let's first talk about BizFX applications. So if we would like to extend a BizFX application, you should know BizFX applications are completely data-driven. So you don't even have to write a line of HTML, CSS, JavaScript. The only thing you have to do is provide data from, for example, the authoring system to the BizFX application. And the BizFX application take care of the rendering, take care of how it should look like. So if you would like to create an application on this level, like the settings application, like the brands application on this top level, you can do that simply not by touching the BizFX application, but simply by adding new blocks to the pipeline, to the corresponding pipelines of SUGCON Commerce. So if we have a look at these pipelines now, we will see there is a specific pipeline, iBizFX navigation pipeline. And in this pipeline, you just simply have to create a new block. In this case, ensure navigation view. Pretty standard, pretty common naming. I took over from decompiled SUGCON sources. So it's always the same naming, so you can find them in your solution even better than before. Now, let's go through the most important parts of the code so that you know if you would like to create a new application, what exactly do you have to do? First, you have to check this block or this class, should it take action? So should I now, as a block, be executed? And this is done at the first place with that if statement. So we try to ask the system, is the current view the tools navigation view? If it is, we just simply create a new class called entity view and fill it with the data. Just view name, icons, naming. And once we have done that, we add that child view to the overall entity view. And once we have done that, it's pretty simple. Once we have done that, and we just publish the solution, we have a basic BizFX application in place. Okay, it's empty, but we have an application. So now let's have a look. If we go into that application, like settings application, and we would like to display various numbers of our entities, like it is in standard. So for example, if you go to Merchandise Manager, you see a list of catalogs. If you go to the custom brands application, it shows a list of brands. In this case, it shows a list of entities of type setting. So if you would like to implement such thing, you just have to create again a block and hook into the iGet entity view pipeline. This pipeline holds a lot of entity view blocks. So this pipeline is always called once you would like to display data in the commerce engine. And if you think of that this pipeline is called and we have an enormous number of blocks, each block, as you can see, should know when it should be executed. So again, we have first an if statement to tell the block if it should be executed. It has exactly, or it reacts exactly on the view name we provided earlier on the application level. So this block just extends the application we would like to show with new data. And it does only if the view name is correct. So once we have done that, we make some I would say, setting up some display naming icons, not really that important, but we can do now with that entity view everything we want. Even more interesting is when we would now like to add child views. This can be done in two ways. Either way, you can just paste the code for the child view itself here, or as seen in SUGCON decompiled codes, they often use custom commands and trigger the command from here. So it's in the end, I guess, up to you how you would like to use it. This one just opens the command, and let's have a look at the command. In the end, it is exactly the same like before. So this command, first, we know now that it should be applied. So this command just on the first-hand side creates an entity view, this accordion, you could say, and gives it a view name. Then, once we created that accordion and added it to the overall view, we have an empty accordion. Now, of course, we would like to fill in data into the accordion. This is done by first retrieving the data. This piece of logic can be much simplified because here's some fallback logic, but in the end, just use the find entities in list pipeline. So once you create new entities, you can fill in the components for membership component and transient membership list component into that or add these components to the entity. And once you persist that entity with these components, SUGCON Commerce automatically handles such commerce lists in the background. So they just maintain all the entities in that list and update these lists on the fly. There are a lot of great blog posts how to use that, so you can just have a look. Of course, one side note: if you're dealing with more than a few entities, you should think of using pagination. That's also out of the box possible, but you would have to implement much more logic. But also there are great blog posts, for example, by Irwin, who describes very good how to use pagination in your custom views. In this case, I assume only to have a few settings, so it's fine to use fine entities in this. Nevertheless, which approach you choose, you have items and you iterate over all these items, and for each item, for each entity, you just create again an entity view. And this time in this entity view, it's quite important because it's quite important to add the entity ID to that view, because once we display that specific entity view, we would like to click on that entity view to land on the detail page, you could say. So we provide data with the entity ID, so in this case, setting ID, and in this entity view, we provide finally view properties, so data to be displayed. In this case, just the name and if the setting is active or not. And you can see in the entity link that this entity link tells the BizFX application, okay, this property name should be a link and it should link to the entity with the ID of previously seen entity ID. So now let's have a look in the detail page. If we have now a look at the detail page, so once we displayed in that accordion the list of entities, and now we click on that entities and land on the detail page with the URL, we now can see the basic entity view quite empty. We now see how this is implemented. So again, we have the get entity view pipeline. We hook into that pipeline with a block. And again, we have some initial checks if we are on the right view and what should we do. This check this time is a little bit larger because we just do not want to see if we are on the right view. We also have to see if an entity ID is provided by the previous call. So if we are on an entity view, we would like to display data of that entity. And to display data of that entity, of course, we have to grab the entity with entity ID. So what we always do is grabbing the entity ID, trying to grab the entity behind the ID and check if that entity is, in this case, a setting entity. And of course, we should check this time if we are in an action. So if that is a form which should be editable, or if it is read-only, so this accordion we already know from entity views. Once we have done that, we can just add new data. So in between, I just skip it. It's again some preparation, some setting of icons, of hints. But the more interesting part is that add basic data call, which does nothing more than, again, creating an entity view, giving that entity view a name, adding a property to that entity view, and add that entity view to the overall entity view as child view, and nothing more. If you would like to add even more and more and more accordions, so more components, policies, you can just extend that, create a new entity view, add that entity view as child view to the parent entity view. And that's it. And then once you deploy that, you see the result that you have the entity view with is active with the accordion and there is active property. So down to here, we learned now how to create a BizFX application, down to the point where we are on the entity view and would like to create an accordion. Now, let me also shortly describe the full potential of that accordion. So again, we have these 4 views: entity view, ensure action, form edit, and do action. These blocks are needed to really empower the accordion with editorial capability. But let's go one by one through them. So entity view, quite simple. Again, in the entity view pipeline, as we saw it, some initial checks. In this case, especially for the settings plugin, we see that it is done in a more generic way via reflection. But in the end, it's nothing more like grabbing the entity, being sure that we should be applied, and add view properties to our new entity view, which is itself added to the entity view. So it's overall entity view. Then, once we have that accordion, we would like to render this small button on the right-hand side, this edit button. That's done via ensure action block. This ensure action block at first has to find out where should it be applied. That's done via view name. So we are on this entity view and it iterates over all the child views in the end over all our accordions and tries to find out which accordion has the right view name where I should be applied. Once it found it, we just go into that accordion and add a new so-called entity action view to that accordion in this actions list. Once we have done that and deploy it, we see that small edit button on the right-hand side. Very important is that you have a unique action name, because once you click on that action, this action name is transmitted to, for example, the form edit block and the do action block, so that they know they should be applied. But in the end, it's nothing more like this. Once you have done that, you have a button. Till here, you have an accordion, you have a button, and of course, this button is not working until we implement, for example, a form edit. That's this modal dialog with all these properties. Again, in the end, it's exactly the same code like in the entity view. So in the end, it's nothing more like a view with properties, but this time it's not read-only. This time we check for an action, and this time we want to make the properties editable. That's the only difference. And because they are so closely coupled, entity view and this form edit, in most scenarios, they are also just one block with a few more checks, so that we have just one block, one entity view block, which handles the displaying of the accordion, but on the other side, also displaying of this edit form, which we see once we click on edit button. But in this case, to be clear, I split them up in entity views and form edit, but in the end, more or less the same. So once we click on the OK button of this form edit and want to save data, so we see the do action, again, but nothing more like checking, can I grab an entity, so setting entity, is the action the right action I have to be? So am I on the right action? Once that is done, I grab the entity, and as you can see in the middle, it just iterates over all the transmitted properties. So in the arguments in the entity view, we have properties, and we can just iterate over the properties via display name, for example, grab the values of the properties, maybe if necessary, cast them in the right data type, and just put them on the entity. It doesn't matter if directly on the entity or on components of the entity. In the end, you just have to call the persist entity in that do action block, and everything is done. And everything is also saved correctly. So you see, you need these 4 blocks: entity view, ensure action, form edit, and do action in the end to have a fully working and fully editable accordion. So let's go back. So you know now from the top to the bottom what has been done and what you should do to create such an application. So let's go back to the sessions goal. So hopefully I fulfilled my own session goal. So you got an idea of how editors can, again, I called it editor-friendly settings maintainability. So they should be able to edit their settings, again, easily inside C. And if you like to plug in and if you like to play around with the plugin, just grab it from GitHub, take it, modify it, play around with it, just whatever you want to do. And the second goal was see in general how things can be easily extended. So you saw the pipelines, you saw data-driven approach, and it's always the same. So hopefully in the future, you are able, if you have the requirement, to also have new entities and make them maintainable, that you are able to create such applications and such views on your own. So by now, I just can say this is more or less this was it from my presentation. So as mentioned earlier in the session, we have a break room, a Chillout lounge. So just take your time, go in there in between, just talk about everything you want. And one note, do not share that on social media. So I just can say thank you. And if you would like to stay in contact with me, you're more than welcome. And now I open for questions. Hopefully I can answer them all.
Hey, thank you very much, Christian. Yeah, really interesting presentation. We haven't got any, we've got one question. Can we watch this presentation later? So absolutely. We are recording them as we go, and fingers crossed it'll work out fine and dandy with the recording. So yeah, just stay tuned.
Yep. Thank you, Christian, for the session. It was
thank you for hosting my presentation. It was a pleasure. Thanks.
We got coming up next. We've got a presentation on troubleshooting site call on Azure PaaS. So that should be interesting. Sri Krishnan and Khushbu will be presenting kind of soon. I think they're online now. I think you're there, guys. If you just want to drop on your webcams, turn them on, and jump on in.
I'm sharing the screen.
Hello, welcome.
Khushbu.
Hey. Hi, Annie.
Hello. Hi.
Hi.
Hey, welcome. Thank you for taking your time out to come and present.
Thank you. Thank you for hosting us.
Our pleasure.
You'll see we've got a slide up for the donate page. We're supporting the Solidarity Response Fund against COVID-19, which is put together by the United Nations and the World Health Organization. So if you want to pop across there and donate, that would be absolutely fantastic. It's to support the frontline workers who are and the essential service workers who are taking the brunt of this at the moment. So yeah, do pop across and donate. I think we've almost got 1,700 euros there. So yeah, you don't have to give a lot, just a little, just a couple of euros, a euro, anything. It's really appreciated. There's also another slide which we're going to pop up in a second, and we've got a virtual chill out room going on. If it's a Zoom meeting, if you want to pop across there, you're more than welcome to join in. Please don't share the password around. We don't want to get Zoom bombed.
Yeah.
There's been a bit of that going on.
Yeah.
So we've got about 10 minutes to you guys kick off. So we'll just, if anyone's got any questions, please use the question panel in the GoToWebinar to ask your questions. All questions appreciated.
Yeah.
And you don't have to wait for the end to ask your questions. Just ask them anytime during the presentation.
Yeah. I don't think so. Any questions?
We did get one comment about, I think, issues that were being faced regarding slide transitions, I guess, because of the delay in network. So in case, Sri Krishnan and Khushbu, in case you want to, you have any slide transitions and you'd like to get rid of them, I guess it's a good way of using 10 minutes.
Good time to do it. Yeah. Yeah, the transitions kind of stutter a bit, so you're getting lag between what's being said and what's shown, which is a bit of a disconnect. So it's cool. We're heading up almost towards the halfway mark.
Halfway stage.
Halfway stage. Going for another 12 hours. So it's a marathon, really. It's an endurance race.
Yes. Also, quickly, just want to share core sampler. I'm not sure whether you guys are seeing the screen.
Yep.
Yeah. So there are a lot of, this is one of the very good podcast for Sidecore. Recently, Thomas is recording, interviewing a lot of MVPs. So you can just hop in and listen to podcasts. There are very good sessions are there.
Well, that's new.
Yeah, that's a small update here. What is the time in India? Almost 2:30.
It's 2:30.
32.
Yeah.
How are things going, Sri Krishnan?
Yeah, it's going. It's work from remote working, right? So we have that difficulties for working, like network connectivity and everything, which happens.
I hope we don't get any network connectivity now.
Gopi, can you give me presenter rights so that I can?
Yeah, sure. I'm giving you 1 second. Attendees.
We'll have time though.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Anyway, like check so that it is easy. The full presentation, slides and all with Khushbu then. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. We are seeing presenters view.
Okay.
Yep. Can you go to full screen?
Yeah, sure. Give me a second.
Take your time. We have 7 minutes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now?
Yeah. We can
Okay.
see the audience view. Yep.
So Gopi and Anita, you have been connecting from morning, right?
No. Bruce
I
and
just
me
hopped
are
in.
connecting.
Yeah, I
Oh,
just
okay.
Bruce
hopped
and
in.
me are doing it from morning. We had Akshay and all for a couple of sessions.
Okay.
Now they will come back. Now they're all
I'm here
asleep.
till the next batch takes over.
Annie is going to take over now.
Oh,
I'm here.
single-handedly.
No, Gopi's here.
Bruce, you are going to be there for a couple of sessions, or is this the last one?
Well, I'm going to last as long as I can until I start
Yeah.
falling asleep at my desk with the head on the keyboard. You know, and comes the next break, and we just hear the snoring.
Yep. I guess next is Jason will be joining. So
Yeah,
after
I'm
2
here for at
sessions.
least another 3 to 4 sessions. I should be here.
Cool.
Mhm.
Azure Pass. We might can just start now. Anyway, is everything ready, right? Or just want to wait?
Yeah, just a couple more minutes. If you've just joined us, you're on the SUGCON Global webinar, and we're just about to kick off a session about troubleshooting Sitecore on Azure PaaS, and being hosted by myself, Bruce Davis-Scott from New Zealand, and Gopi Krishna, also from New Zealand. It's the Kiwis ruling the roost at the moment.
Yes. And Anita from India. Annie from India.
And our friends from India, yeah, it's really, the time zones are really interesting. It's just fantastic.
Oh, all fun in calculations.
Yeah. There's been a few of those discussions going on. Ah, 3 minutes to go. Do you think we should start early? I don't know. Somebody might be really running to the clock. Nah, we should start.